So this is a topic that has always interested me because it's something that related to my life and something that I've had a lot of experience with. And ever since learning more about it and learning all the ins and outs of everything that's going on in the specific topic, I really found it fascinating, and it's something that I definitely like to try to share with people so that they understand more about our pattern seeking abilities and our own consciousness. And today, I want to talk about specifically synchronicity and whether it's even real or if it's just all delusion. So we know that there is we can put it into two categories: either meaningful synchronicities, so things that actually have some type of meaning and that have information that you can learn from, and things that are just coincidence, so basically they feel like they have some sort of connection to a higher understanding, but really it's just something random that happened or occurred. And where I sit on this is pretty complex, because on the one hand I am very skeptical of synchronicities now, and I'll explain why in a little bit later. But I also recognize that there are some instances where synchronicities are just so statistically impossible that it doesn't seem like it was just a random coincidence. And specifically, I'm referring to things that have that defy incredible odds, and often experiences that are almost chain reactions of synchronicity. So it's a very hard thing to really wrap your head around, and whether you should ignore it all or whether you should keep an eye open to it. And I've pretty much settled along the middle of that situation, where I believe that I should keep an eye out, but I should be very skeptical on what I consider to be meaningful and not meaningful. And my journey on this essentially started back in 2013. Back in 2013, I was experiencing very profound chain reactions of synchronicities that were actually feeding me information that consciously I wasn't aware of. Now, it's possible that some of this information was in me subconsciously, and this experience pretty much laid it out in a way that I could understand it, and the way and made it seem like it was new information. And I began to follow these what I felt was truly genuine synchronicities that really had a lot of meaning. And this happened in a climactic type of experience, and it ended in me communicating with strange voices in my head that were actually feeding me information that I didn't know. And it was all a huge compilation of synchronicities that were just firing off in a way that I couldn't avoid. So after this experience happened, it caused me to end up consciously trying to look for more synchronicities and believing that they were all over the place. And the more that you're trying to look for these things, the more that you're gonna end up finding it. If you've ever watched the movie The Number 23, I believe that they had a similar concept. The more you go looking for the number, the more you're going to find it. And that's basically what ended up happening with me. I started to look for it everywhere. And in that circumstance, I started to experience a lot more coincidences and synchronicities. And my brain was starting to connect them all into bizarre beliefs and bizarre thoughts. And before I knew it, I was completely going over the deep end, believing that the radio and songs were being written directly for me to send me a message, and somehow strangers knew who I was but pretended not to, and they would, let's say, make Facebook statuses that are directed towards me but not specifically coming out and saying that. So what started off as what seemed like genuine, meaningful synchronicities ended up evolving or devolving into something called delusions of reference. So I was essentially in a schizophrenic state, or a mad state, basically. And my behavior was also manic, so I believe that I was finding some secret order in the universe. And what ended up happening was textbook schizophrenia. If you look up delusions of reference, it's basically when someone believes that a billboard is talking to them, or a message directly for them, and they're basically attaching meaning to meaningless coincidences. And this, I only began to understand what was going on, and once I watched a TED Talk called "The Patterns of Self-Deception" by Michael Shermer. And Michael Shermer is a professional skeptic. Now, I don't believe all of the things that he believes, but I was very profoundly affected and pretty much cured by watching his video, because he really breaks down what conspiracy theorists are and why their brain is basically behaving the way they do. And what he coined the term as is a increase in patternicity. So the patternicity is our tendency to find meaningful patterns in meaningless noise. So he described it as a he broke it down into two things, which are called type 1 and type 2 errors. And a type 1 error is a false positive, so it's believing a pattern is real when it isn't. And then a type 2 error is believing a pattern is false when it's actually true, so that would be a false negative. And apparently we evolved to somehow balance these things. So it's basically the we're basically weighing if the potential to make a type 1 error is worse than making a type 2 error. And how he described this was, he said, imagine you're walking along some sort of forest or whatever, and you hear a rustle in the bushes. Now, he says, if you believe that the rustle in the bushes is a dangerous predator like a tiger, and it turns out that it's just nothing, then you've made a type 1 error, so a false positive. But he said that that's not a big deal. You just, you're more cautious, and you say, oh, okay, so that was nothing. But if you were to walk by a bush and believe that the rustle in the grass is just the wind, but it turns out to be a dangerous predator, then you've made a false negative, which is a type 2 error, and which means that you are essentially taken out of the gene pool in your lunch. So there's a danger in not being able to gauge when you should be making a type 1 or a type 2 error. The problem is that with higher levels of dopamine, you end up making that basically increases your patternicity. So you end up making more type 1 errors or false positives than you would be without them. So he described this as a relationship with a relationship called signal to noise ratio. And he said that dopamine increases our signal to noise ratio. So if you have too low dopamine, then you make too many type 2 errors, which are, as I said, false negatives. So you don't want it to be too low, because then you might miss certain important information. But on the other spectrum, if it's too high, then you end up making too many type 1 errors, and that means that you're seeing too many patterns. So there is a downfall to seeing too many patterns, and that would be what I was experiencing with the synchronicity thing, where I ended up seeing too many synchronicities and things that I thought had a connection but actually didn't have a connection. And he would explain this by showing pictures of a Dalmatian that is a little bit blurry, or there's noise around it, but you could still see the Dalmatian. And then he would show a picture of Saturn, which is still kind of blurry, but you can see the picture. And then he would show a picture of complete noise, so white noise, and he would ask, is there anything in this image? And if you were to say yes, then you've made a type 1 error, or a false positive, seeing something where there is nothing. And that, even though in some instances that can be a problem, it's also the explanation of why people are more creative when their dopamine is higher. And with higher dopamine levels, you're making more abstract connections. And even though these connections might not be true or might not be something that is accurate, it can often lead to associations that are new, that other people haven't really connected before. So this is why any type of drug that increases dopamine levels, it leads to more creativity, because you're making connections where other people would not be making connections. So there is definite truth in why people with mental illnesses such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder and so on might be more creative, because they're making more abstract connections that other people aren't making, because their pattern recognition is a lot higher. So for some reason, psychedelics have a different effect. They also have this dopamine increase, which causes a greater increase in patternicity. But there's something more profound that goes on, because it includes visionary states, which seem to be, everything that you're seeing seems to be highly aesthetic and highly complex geometric forms. And it somehow it's going beyond just the patternicity increase of something. For example, cocaine. So cocaine, it might make you more creative in certain circumstances, but it's not going to cause such an increase in creativity that you're even though you're making greater poetry, there's also a visual element into it. There's something about psychedelics that completely enhance this patternicity increase into something that goes beyond any of it. And that's pretty much why I believe psychedelics are different from other drugs in terms of its effect on creativity, because there's an element to it that transcends everything, that is just completely superior in terms of its ability to transform our creativity. And I don't know exactly why that is, but for an example, if you were to show someone on psychedelics a picture of white noise, just static, they would be seeing a bunch of faces and a bunch of really complex forms that are almost collaged in with it, because it's affecting our pareidolia and our facial recognition. So that's why we see a lot more faces in our peripherals and things when we take psychedelics. And often people report hallucination persistent disorder as seeing faces and things well after they've had their trip. And that's something that I've experienced, but I know personally that that's just because it's increased my pattern recognition, so I'm experiencing more pareidolia, so I'm seeing more faces and things, because technically my brain is more creative and it's making more connections. And I think that it's very important to understand this relationship between high and low patternicity, because this is what really separates people that understand their madness to people that don't really get a handle on it. So it's very hard to determine whether things like synchronicity are just poetic patternicity increases that don't actually mean something, but it's just our brain trying to connect things, and whether it's actually something that is a message or something that actually truly means something objectively and not just subjectively. It's a very hard line to walk, as you can probably understand by this video. So I'm still on the fence. I don't know if synchronicity is real or if it's just all coincidence and means nothing other than what meaning we provide it. It's a tough topic, but we really need to kind of work it out in our brains. So I want to leave this video with a question on what you guys believe. Do you guys believe that synchronicity in some circumstances is a real thing, or is it all just delusion? Is it all just meaningless coincidence? So I think that I'm not going to be able to find the true answer about that, but all I can say is that I've experienced some synchronicities that seem to be completely impossible, but I've also gone overboard with my ability to see synchronicities and started to believe things that don't connect, and that I just didn't think through carefully enough to really understand that I was making a type 1 error. So I'll leave you guys with that, and I will see you guys in the next video. So have a good night.